My whole life was a lie.
You know what they say about karma being a witch? Well, let me tell you something. Sometimes karma needs a little help from a guy who's got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. My name is Nick Carlson, and this is the story of how I went from being a washed-up contractor living above a boxing gym to the man who brought down the entire social pyramid that crushed me. It started 3 months ago when Vanessa, my ex-wife of 15 years, decided I wasn't good enough for her anymore. Standing in our cramped living room with her perfectly manicured nails wrapped around a glass of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, she delivered the ending blow. Nick, let's face it, you're 42 years old and you're still swinging a hammer for a living. Jake is 16, Emily is 14. They need a father who can provide them with opportunities, not someone who comes home covered in sawdust every night. I remember staring at her, this woman I'd loved since college, wondering when she'd become so cold. Her blonde hair was styled in that expensive way that screamed, "I'm too good for this house," and her designer clothes looked out of place in our modest suburban home. "So what are you saying, Ness?" She set down her wine glass with a dramatic sigh. "I'm saying I've found someone who can give us the life we deserve. Damian Price. You might have heard of him. He's the tech entrepreneur who sold his startup for $200 million last year." The name hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. I'd seen Damian Price in the local newspaper, photographed at charity galas and business events. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of guy who wore $1,000 suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. "You're leaving me for him?" "I'm leaving you for a better future." Her voice was ice cold. "The kids deserve private schools, college funds, opportunities. What can you give them? A legacy of calloused hands and back problems." That was when 16-year-old Jake walked into the room, his face twisted with the kind of anger only teenagers can muster. "Mom, are you serious right now? Dad works his A off for us." "Language, Jake." Vanessa's tone was sharp. "And yes, I'm serious. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions for the good of the family." Emily appeared behind her brother, tears already streaming down her 14-year-old face. "You're breaking up our family for money?" "I'm giving you both a chance at a real future," Vanessa snapped. "Your father had 15 years to make something of himself. This is what he chose." I felt something die inside me that night. Not just my marriage, but my faith in the woman I'd built my entire adult life around. Within a week, she'd moved the kids into Damien's penthouse apartment in Manhattan. Within a month, they were married in a ceremony that probably cost more than I'd made in the past 3 years. And me? I found myself living in a studio apartment above Murphy's boxing gym on the Lower East Side, listening to the sound of heavy bags being pummeled every morning at 6 a.m. The irony wasn't lost on me. I felt like one of those bags, beaten senseless and hanging by a thread. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Vanessa's new husband had hired the kind of lawyers who could probably get a serial butcher acquitted on a technicality. They painted me as an underachiever, a man who'd held his family back through lack of ambition. The judge awarded her primary custody, the house, and half of what little savings I had. But here's where the story gets interesting, where karma decided to show up fashionably late to the party. 2 weeks ago, I was cleaning out the last of my belongings from the house. Vanessa was in the Hamptons with Damien and the kids, so I had the place to myself. I was in the attic, boxing up old photo albums and wondering how my life had gone so spectacularly wrong, when I noticed something I'd never seen before. Behind a stack of Christmas decorations, wedged between 2 support beams, was an old leather briefcase. It was covered in dust and looked like it had been there for decades. There was a brass nameplate on the front that made my heart skip a beat. Nicholas Carlson Sr., my grandfather. The man who died when I was 12, leaving behind stories of business success and a reputation as one of the shrewdest entrepreneurs in New York. My father had always been vague about Grandpa Nick's affairs, saying only that the old man's business ventures had dried up after his death. The briefcase was locked, but 15 years of construction work had taught me a thing or two about getting into places I wasn't supposed to be. A few minutes with a screwdriver, and the ancient lock gave way. What I found inside changed everything. The first document I pulled out was a will, dated just 6 months before my grandfather's death. My hands shook as I read the opening lines. I, Nicholas Carlson Sr., being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all business holdings, properties, and financial assets, to my grandson, Nicholas Carlson Jr., to be held in trust until his 35th birthday. I was 42. I'd been the rightful heir to my grandfather's fortune for 7 years and never knew it. But that wasn't even the best part. Underneath the will were financial documents, business contracts, and correspondence that painted a picture so shocking I had to read everything twice to believe it. My grandfather hadn't just been successful, he'd been a goddamn genius. Carlson Industries, the company I'd been told had failed after his death, was very much alive. Not only alive, but thriving. The business had been quietly managed by a board of trustees for the past 30 years, growing from a modest construction company into a diversified empire worth over $200 million. And according to these documents, every penny of it belonged to me. There was more. Letters from lawyers, accountants, and business managers, all addressed to me at various addresses over the years. Letters that had never reached me. Intercepted and hidden by people I'd trusted, letters explaining my inheritance, requesting meetings, asking for instructions on how to manage my assets. The picture became crystal clear as I dug deeper into the briefcase. My own father, along with several other family members, had been systematically stealing from my inheritance for decades. They'd forged documents, bribed officials, and created an elaborate web of lies to keep me from discovering the truth. And Vanessa? Sweet, ambitious Vanessa had known. There were letters addressed to her, dated from early in our marriage, explaining the situation and offering her substantial payments to keep me distracted and unaware of my true circumstances. My wife hadn't left me because I was a failure. She'd left me because she was afraid I might someday discover I was anything but. I sat in that dusty attic for 3 hours, reading and rereading every document. By the time I was finished, I wasn't the same man who'd climbed those stairs. The broken, defeated contractor was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone with a score to settle, and the resources to do it properly. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on one of the legal letters, and a secretary answered on the second ring. Whitmore, Davidson and Associates, how may I help you? This is Nicholas Carlson Jr. I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore immediately. Tell him it's about the Carlson Industries Trust. There was a pause, then rapid typing. Carlson, we've been trying to reach you for years. Can you hold for just one moment? 60 seconds later, a distinguished voice came on the line. Mr. Carlson, this is Charles Whitmore. Where the heck have you been? Charles Whitmore's office, occupying the entire top floor of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, the kind of place where deals worth hundreds of millions were discussed over single malt scotch and handshakes that could make or break entire industries. Sitting across from him in a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, I felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, Whitmore said, sliding a thick folder across his mahogany desk. He suspected that certain family members might try to interfere with his wishes after his death. That's why he set up such an elaborate system of safeguards. I opened the folder and nearly choked on my coffee. The first page showed the current value of Carlson Industries, $247,000. The second page listed my personal assets, real estate holdings across 3 states, investment portfolios, and enough liquid cash to buy a small country. This is insane, I muttered. How did they keep this from me for 30 years? Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Your father was quite clever, I'll give him that. He managed to intercept most of our correspondence by filing change of address forms with the Postal Service whenever we tried to contact you. When that stopped working, he convinced a corrupt postal employee to redirect our letters to a P.O. box he controlled. And the legal system just allowed this? Your father presented forged documents claiming you'd signed power of attorney over to him due to mental incompetence. We challenged it multiple times, but he had medical records, fake ones we discovered later, supporting his claims. The legal battles went on for years. I thought about my father, who had died 5 years ago from a heart attack. He'd lived modestly, never showing any signs of the wealth he'd been stealing from me. What did he do with the money? Gambled most of it away, from what we can tell. Your Uncle Robert got a good chunk, as did several cousins. They've been living off your inheritance like parasites for decades. The rage building inside me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just anger, it was a cold, calculating fury that demanded satisfaction. And my wife knew about this? Whitmore nodded grimly. We have records of payments made to her over the years. 50,000 here, 100,000 there. Enough to keep her comfortable and motivated to maintain the status quo. I thought about all the times Vanessa had mysteriously come up with money for things we couldn't afford. New furniture, expensive vacations, designer clothes for the kids. I'd assumed she was just good at finding deals or using credit cards. The truth was so much worse. What are my options, Ma? I asked. Well, the good news is that the original will is ironclad. Your grandfather's lawyers were the best money could buy, and they anticipated every possible challenge. As of today, you are the sole owner and CEO of Carlson Industries, with full authority to make any decisions you see fit. Whitmore pulled out another document. This includes the power to terminate any existing contracts, fire any employees, and restructure the company however you choose. Several of your relatives are currently on the payroll in executive positions. I assume you'll want to make some changes there. I smiled for the first time in months. Oh, I'm going to make a lot of changes. Over the next 2 hours, Whitmore walked me through the full scope of my inheritance. Carlson Industries owned construction companies, real estate developments, technology firms, and investment portfolios that would make Wall Street executives weep with envy. My grandfather had built an empire, and now it was mine. But the best part wasn't the money, it was the power. The power to finally fight back against the people who'd stolen my life piece by piece, year by year. There's one more thing, Whitmore said as our meeting was winding down. Your grandfather left specific instructions about what to do if the family conspiracy was ever discovered. He wanted you to have these. He handed me a sealed envelope marked for Nicholas Jr., when justice comes calling. Inside was a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, along with several photographs and documents I didn't recognize. My dear grandson, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means the wolves have finally been exposed. I always suspected that my death would bring out the worst in certain family members, and I'm sorry you've had to suffer for their greed. But now you have the tools to make things right. Use them wisely, but use them completely. Some people only understand consequences when they're delivered with interest. Your loving grandfather, Nicholas Sr. The photographs were surveillance shots of various family members, including my father, engaged in activities that looked decidedly shady. The documents were copies of financial records showing exactly how much each person had stolen from my inheritance over the years. Uncle Robert, who'd always claimed to be struggling to make ends meet, had taken over $3 million. Cousin Sandra, who'd married into money and looked down on me at every family gathering, had pocketed nearly $2 million. Even my younger brother Tom, who I'd helped through college and supported during his early career, had taken several $100,000. But the biggest revelation was in the final photograph. It showed Vanessa meeting with my father at an upscale restaurant, accepting what appeared to be an envelope full of cash. The date stamp showed it was taken just 2 months before she'd asked for the divorce. Everything clicked into place. The sudden dissatisfaction with our lifestyle, the criticism of my career choices, the convenient appearance of Damian Price in her life. It had all been orchestrated in a carefully planned exit strategy funded by my own money. I left Whitmore's office that day with a new purpose. The broken contractor who'd walked in was gone, replaced by someone with the resources and motivation to settle some very old scores. My first stop was Carlson Industries headquarters, an impressive glass tower in Midtown that I'd passed hundreds of times without knowing I owned it. The security guard at the front desk nearly fell out of his chair when I introduced myself. Mr. Carlson? The real Mr. Carlson? Sir, we've been wondering when you'd show up. Your Uncle Robert has been running things, but we all knew something wasn't right. I took the elevator to the top floor where the executive offices were located. Uncle Robert's name was on the door of the largest corner office, the office that should have been mine for the past 7 years. I walked in without knocking. Robert was on the phone, feet up on the desk, laughing about something. He looked up when I entered, and the color drained from his face. I'll call you back, he said quickly, hanging up the phone. Nick, what a surprise. What brings you here? My office, I said simply. I'm here to take back my office. Robert's laugh was nervous, forced. Your office? Nick, I think there's been some confusion. This company has been in the family for years, and I pulled out the will and dropped it on his desk. Read it. He picked up the document with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the legal language. I watched as the reality of his situation sank in. This, this can't be right. Your father said you'd signed everything over to the family trust. He had documents. Forged documents, I interrupted. I've spent the morning with lawyers, Robert. I know exactly what you and Dad did, and I know exactly how much you've stolen from me over the years. Robert stood up, trying to regain some composure. Now wait just a minute. I've been working my tail off to keep this company running while you were playing with hammers and nails. You deserve a prison cell, I said calmly. But I'm feeling generous today. You have 1 hour to clean out your desk and leave the building. If you're still here when I come back, I'm calling the police. You can't do this. I have contracts, obligations. You had contracts, I corrected. As of right now, you're unemployed. And Robert, I want every penny back. My lawyers will be in touch about repayment schedules. I turned and walked out, leaving him sputtering behind me. It felt better than anything I'd experienced in years. My next stop was Cousin Sandra's office, 3 floors down. She was in a meeting with several other executives when I walked in. I'm sorry, we're in the middle of something important, she said without looking up from her presentation. So am I replied. I'm in the middle of firing you. That got her attention. She looked up, saw me standing there, and her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion. Nick, what are you doing here? And what do you mean, firing me? I explained the situation to her and the other executives in the room. By the time I was finished, Sandra was crying and the other executives were staring at me with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. Please, Sandra begged. I have a mortgage, kids in college. You didn't know that stealing millions of dollars from your cousin was wrong? I asked. That's interesting. I'm sure the IRS will find your moral flexibility fascinating when they audit your tax returns for the past decade. I spent the rest of the afternoon systematically firing every family member who'd been feeding off my inheritance. By 5 o'clock, I'd cleaned house completely, replacing the thieves with competent executives who'd been waiting years for their chance to run things properly. But the family was just the appetizer. The main course was going to be much more satisfying. The next phase of my plan required a more delicate touch. Vanessa had built her new life on a foundation of lies and stolen money, but she'd also surrounded herself with Manhattan's social elite, people who valued reputation above all else. If I wanted to destroy her properly, I needed to attack her where it would hurt the most. Her precious social standing. I started by doing something I hadn't done in years. I bought myself some decent clothes. Not just decent, spectacular. When you're worth $250 million, you can afford to shop at places where they know your name and bring you champagne while you try on suits that cost more than most people's cars. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the tired contractor in work boots and flannel shirts. In his place stood a man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, someone who could write checks that would make grown men weep. My first public appearance was at the Metropolitan Museum's annual charity gala, an event Vanessa had mentioned attending with Damien. I purchased a table for 10 at $50,000, pocket change considering my new circumstances, and invited some of the most influential people in New York's business community. The look on Vanessa's face when she saw me across the ballroom was worth every penny I'd spent on the evening. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. Her arm linked with Damien's as they worked the room like the power couple they pretended to be. I watched them for a while, studying their interactions with other guests. Damien was smooth, I had to give him that. He had the kind of effortless charm that came from years of convincing people to give him money. But there was something desperate in his eyes, a hunger that suggested his success might not be as solid as it appeared. Nick Carlson? The voice behind me belonged to Margaret Whitfield, one of New York's most prominent socialites and a woman whose approval could make or break careers. I heard you were back in circulation. Congratulations on reclaiming your grandfather's company. He was a remarkable man. I turned and smiled. Mrs. Whitfield, what a pleasure. Yes, it's been quite an adjustment, but I'm looking forward to carrying on his legacy. I imagine you are. Tell me, what are your plans for Carlson Industries? There are so many opportunities in today's market. We talked for several minutes about business, philanthropy, and the various social obligations that came with wealth. I could see Vanessa watching us from across the room, her expression growing more confused and concerned with each passing moment. You know, Mrs. Whitfield said quietly, I was quite surprised when your ex-wife married Damian Price so quickly after your divorce. It seemed rather opportunistic. Vanessa has always been good at recognizing opportunities, I replied carefully. I'm sure she and Damian are very happy together. Mrs. Whitfield's smile was knowing. Of course, though I do hope she's done her due diligence on his financial situation. There are some concerning rumors circulating about his business practices. This was interesting. What kind of rumors? Oh, you know how these things go. Whispers about inflated valuations, questionable partnerships, the usual concerns when someone rises too quickly. I'm sure it's nothing serious, but in our circles, reputation is everything. I filed this information away for later use. If Damien had vulnerabilities, I intended to find and exploit them. The evening continued with the usual mix of speeches, presentations, and networking. I made sure to introduce myself to as many influential people as possible, establishing my presence in the social circles that Vanessa now considered her domain. Near the end of the night, she finally approached me. Damien was nowhere to be seen, probably in the men's room or networking with potential investors. Nick, she said, her voice carefully neutral, I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here. This doesn't seem like your kind of event. People change, Vanessa. I've had some good fortune recently. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of good fortune? The kind that comes from discovering what's rightfully yours? I replied. You look beautiful tonight, by the way. That dress must have cost a fortune. Damien is very generous, she said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. I'm sure he is. Tell me, how are the kids adjusting to their new life? I haven't seen them since the custody hearing. They're fine. They love the penthouse. And Damien has been wonderful with them. Jake is looking at prep schools, and Emily is taking piano lessons from a teacher who works with Carnegie Hall musicians. That sounds expensive. We can afford it, she said quickly. Damien's very successful. So I've heard. Though I also heard there might be some challenges with his business ventures. Nothing serious, I'm sure. But you know how volatile the tech industry can be. The color drained from her face slightly. What do you mean? Oh, just cocktail party gossip. You know how people talk. I'm sure everything is fine. Damien appeared at her elbow, looking slightly flustered. Vanessa, we should go. Early morning tomorrow. He glanced at me, and I could see him trying to place my face. I extended my hand. Damien Price, I presume? I'm Nick Carlson. I've heard so much about you. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were calculating. Carlson. Why does that name sound familiar? Probably from the business pages. I recently took over Carlson Industries. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Carlson Industries. But that's... You're Vanessa's ex-husband, I finished. Small world, isn't it? Vanessa was staring at me with a mixture of shock and growing panic. Nick, what's going on? What company? You're a contractor. Was a contractor, I corrected. Now I'm a CEO. Funny how life works out, isn't it? Damien had recovered some of his composure, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was smart enough to realize that his wife's ex-husband, suddenly having serious money, was a problem for him on multiple levels. Well, congratulations on your success, he said carefully. Vanessa, we really should go. They left quickly after that, but not before I saw Damien whispering urgently in Vanessa's ear. I was sure they'd be having a very interesting conversation on the ride home. Over the next few weeks, I made myself a fixture in Manhattan's social scene. I attended gallery openings, charity luncheons, and business dinners. I donated generously to causes that mattered to the right people and made sure my name appeared in the society pages regularly. The effect on Vanessa was exactly what I'd hoped for. She'd built her new identity around being the wife of a successful tech entrepreneur, the woman who'd traded up from a blue-collar husband to Manhattan royalty. My sudden appearance in her world, backed by wealth that dwarfed Damien's, was undermining everything she'd worked to achieve. But I wasn't content with just making her uncomfortable. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with, so I hired a private investigator to look into Damien's business affairs. The report I received 2 weeks later was even better than I'd hoped. Damien Price was a fraud, but a sophisticated one. His tech startup had been sold for $200 million, but he'd only received about $30 million after investors, lawyers, and creditors were paid. He'd been living off that money for 3 years, maintaining the illusion of continued success, while his actual wealth steadily dwindled. Worse, he'd made several disastrous investments in the past year. losing most of what remained of his fortune on cryptocurrency schemes and startup companies that existed only on paper. According to my investigator, Damien was probably down to his last few million, still wealthy by normal standards, but practically broke by Manhattan socialite standards. The penthouse apartment he was renting for $30,000 a month. The cars were leased. Even his expensive watches were financed. Damien Price was a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. I was going to be that wind. My opportunity came at a private investment dinner hosted by one of New York's most exclusive venture capital firms. Damien was there, naturally, trying to drum up interest in his latest revolutionary business concept. I listened to his pitch with growing amusement. It was the kind of vague, buzzword-heavy presentation that sounded impressive to people who didn't understand technology but meant absolutely nothing to anyone with actual business experience. When the Q&A session began, I raised my hand. Damien, this sounds fascinating. Can you tell us more about your revenue projections? Specifically, how you plan to monetize users in the first 18 months? It was a perfectly reasonable question, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He launched into a rambling non-answer full of marketing speak and industry jargon that ultimately said nothing at all. I followed up with another question, then another, each one more specific and technical than the last. By the time I was finished, it was clear to everyone in the room that Damien either didn't understand his own business model or was deliberately trying to obscure the details. The other investors began asking their own pointed questions, and Damien's presentation fell apart completely. He left the dinner without securing any funding, and I was sure word of his poor performance would spread quickly through Manhattan's tight-knit business community. But that was just the opening move. The real game was about to begin. The beauty of having unlimited resources is that you can afford to be patient. I spent the next month carefully orchestrating Damien's downfall, while simultaneously rebuilding relationships with my children. The custody arrangement gave Vanessa primary custody, but I still had visitation rights, and now I could offer Jake and Emily things that even Damien's wealth couldn't match. Like honesty, for instance. I picked them up for our scheduled weekend visit on a Friday evening, driving a new Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses. Jake, now 17 and even more cynical than I remembered, whistled appreciatively when he saw the car. "Nice ride, Dad. Did you rob a bank or something?" "Something like that," I replied, opening the door for Emily. She was 15 now, taller and more mature than when I'd last seen her regularly. The hurt in her eyes was still there, but it was mixed with curiosity. "Mom says you inherited some money," she said carefully as we drove toward my new apartment, a spacious penthouse I'd purchased on the Upper East Side. "Your mom's right. It turns out your great-grandfather was more successful than anyone realized. He left me his business, and it's been doing very well." Jake leaned forward from the back seat. "How well are we talking here?" I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Well enough that you won't have to worry about college tuition, or anything else, for that matter." The apartment impressed them both, though they tried to hide it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of Central Park, and the space was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that screamed expensive without being flashy. "This is incredible, Dad," Emily said, exploring the kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops. "How long have you been living here?" "About 3 weeks. I wanted to make sure it was ready before you saw it." Jake was examining the entertainment system, which included a television larger than some movie theater screens. "Does Mom know about all this?" "She knows some of it. We're still figuring out how everything affects the custody arrangement." That was an understatement. Vanessa's lawyers had been calling Whitmore's office daily since news of my inheritance had become public. The original custody agreement had been based on my limited financial resources and unstable living situation. Now that I could provide the kids with anything they wanted, the legal landscape had shifted dramatically. We ordered dinner from one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place that normally required reservations weeks in advance but would deliver anywhere for the right price. As we ate, I told them the truth about what had happened to our family. Not all of it, of course. They didn't need to know about their mother's financial arrangements with my father or about the systematic theft that had kept me poor for decades. But they deserved to understand that our divorce hadn't been about my failure as a provider. It had been about greed and deception. "So you were rich this whole time?" Jake asked, struggling to process the information. "I was supposed to be rich. Your great-grandfather left me everything when I turned 35, but certain family members made sure I never found out about it, including Mom." Emily's voice was small, but there was steel underneath it. I chose my words carefully. Your mother made decisions based on the information she had at the time. I can't speak to her motivations, but I can tell you that things are going to be different now. Different was an understatement. Over the weekend, I showed them a life they'd never imagined possible. We went shopping at stores where the salespeople knew my name and treated us like royalty. We had lunch at restaurants where celebrities sat at nearby tables. We toured a private art collection that most people could only see in museums. But the best part was watching them relax for the first time in months. The tension they'd been carrying since the divorce began to fade as they realized that their future was secure, that they wouldn't have to choose between their parents based on who could provide for them better. On Sunday evening, when I drove them back to Damien's penthouse, they were different kids than the ones I'd picked up 2 days earlier. Dad, Jake said as we pulled up to the building, can we talk to you about something? Of course. Emily took a deep breath. We want to live with you. Full time, I mean. Not just weekends. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Are you sure? That's a big change. And your mother? Our mother lied to us, Jake interrupted. She told us you couldn't provide for us, that we needed Damien to have a good life. But you could have given us everything we needed all along if she hadn't hidden the truth. She made us choose between having nice things and having our real father, Emily added. That's not fair. I looked up at the penthouse windows, knowing that Vanessa was probably watching us from above. It's complicated, guys. There are legal issues, custody agreements. We're old enough to decide where we want to live, Jake said firmly. And we want to live with you. That night, I called Whitmore and told him to file for emergency custody modification. With my changed circumstances and the kids' expressed preferences, we had a strong case. More importantly, I had the resources to hire the kind of legal team that could make things happen quickly. But legal battles take time, and I had other scores to settle while the lawyers did their work. My investigation into Damien's finances had revealed something interesting. He owed significant money to some very unforgiving people. His cryptocurrency investments hadn't just failed. They'd been outright scams, and he'd borrowed heavily to make them. The people he'd borrowed from were the kind who expected payment, regardless of circumstances. I arranged to meet with Vincent Torino, one of Damien's creditors, at a discreet restaurant in Little Italy. Torino was exactly what you'd expect from someone in his line of work. Expensive suit, gold jewelry, and eyes that had seen too much. Mr. Carlson, he said as we shook hands. I have to admit, I was curious when you called. What's your interest in Damien Price's situation? He married my ex-wife, I replied simply. I want to understand what kind of man is living with my children. Torino's smile was predatory. Ah, I see. Well, I can tell you that Mr. Price is not the successful businessman he pretends to be. He owes my associates nearly $2 million, and he's been very creative about avoiding payment. What kind of timeline are we talking about? He was supposed to pay last month. We've been patient, but our patience has limits. I'd say he has maybe 2 weeks before we start exploring alternative collection methods. I leaned back in my chair, considering the possibilities. What if someone were to pay his debt? Hypothetically speaking. Hypothetically, that someone would own Mr. Price's debt, along with all the rights and obligations that come with it. And what would those rights include? Torino's grin widened. Complete financial disclosure for starters. Asset seizure if necessary. The usual remedies available to creditors when dealing with deadbeat borrowers. We shook hands again, and I left the restaurant with a new plan forming in my mind. $2 million was nothing to me now. Pocket change that I could afford to lose without thinking twice. But to Damien, it represented salvation or destruction, depending on how I chose to use it. I bought his debt that afternoon. The next morning, I had my lawyers serve him with papers demanding immediate payment of the full amount, plus interest and penalties. According to the documents, he had 72 hours to comply or face asset seizure and public financial disclosure. The phone call came that evening. What the heck do you think you're doing? Damien's voice was tight with panic and rage. I'm collecting a debt, I replied calmly. You borrowed money and now it's time to pay it back. This is harassment. I'll have you arrested. For what? Exercising my legal rights as a creditor? I don't think so, Damien. You're a businessman. You understand how these things work. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different, desperate, pleading. Look, Nick, I know this is about Vanessa, but she made her choice, and you need to respect that. I can pay you back, but I need time Time is the one thing you don't have, I replied. 72 hours, Damien. After that, I start seizing assets. You can't do this. I have a reputation to protect. So did I once upon a time. Funny how quickly reputations can change, isn't it? I hung up and poured myself a glass of very expensive scotch. The game was entering its final phase, and I was holding all the cards. The next 2 days were a masterclass in watching a man's world collapse in slow motion. Damien tried everything, calling in favors, liquidating assets, even attempting to borrow more money to pay off what he already owed. But his reputation in the business community had been damaged by his poor performance at the investment dinner, and word of his financial troubles was spreading quickly. On the third day, when payment was due, he called again. I need an extension, he said without preamble. Just one more week. No, please, Nick, I'm begging you. Vanessa doesn't know how bad things are. If this comes out, it'll destroy her too. Vanessa made her bed when she chose money over family, I replied. Now she gets to lie in it. That afternoon, my lawyers began the asset seizure process. The penthouse apartment lease was terminated immediately. It had been in Damien's name, and he could no longer afford the rent. The cars were repossessed. Even his expensive watches and jewelry were claimed as collateral. By evening, Damien Price had gone from Manhattan socialite to effectively homeless, and everyone in their social circle knew about it. But I wasn't finished yet. The final act required a more personal touch. The charity auction at the Plaza Hotel was the social event of the season, the kind of gathering where Manhattan's elite came to see and be seen while pretending to care about worthy causes. I'd purchased a table for $20,000 and invited some of the most influential people in the city to join me. Vanessa and Damien arrived fashionably late, trying to maintain appearances despite their dramatically changed circumstances. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn to the Met Gala months earlier, something that wouldn't have been noticed by most people. But in their social circle, repeating outfits was a sign of financial distress. Damien looked haggard, the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of sleepless nights and constant stress. They'd been staying at a modest hotel since losing the penthouse, and the strain was showing on both of them. I watched them work the room, trying to maintain their social connections while carefully avoiding any conversations about their living situation. It was painful and satisfying at the same time, like watching a beautifully choreographed dance of desperation. The auction itself was typical of such events. Overpriced items that people bid on more for the social currency than any actual desire to own them. I participated selectively, winning a few pieces that caught my interest and establishing myself as a serious player in the evening's activities. Then came the item I'd been waiting for. A week-long vacation package at an exclusive resort in the Caribbean. Donated by one of the city's most prestigious travel agencies, the bidding started at $5,000 and quickly escalated as several couples competed for the prize. Damien raised his paddle when the bidding reached $15,000, trying to project an image of continued wealth. I let him think he was going to win, watching as the price climbed to $20,000, then $25,000. At $30,000, the other bidders dropped out, leaving just Damien and me. He looked across the room at me with growing panic as he realized what was happening. $35,000, I called out, my voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. Damien hesitated, his paddle halfway raised. $35,000 was probably more than he had left in his bank account, but backing down now would be a public admission of his financial problems. $40,000, he said, his voice barely audible. $50,000, I replied immediately, not even pausing to consider the amount. The room had gone quiet now, sensing the drama playing out between us. This wasn't just about a vacation package. Everyone could feel the personal animosity crackling in the air. Damien looked at Vanessa, who was staring at him with a mixture of panic and fury. She knew they couldn't afford to bid any higher, but she also knew what it would mean if he backed down now. $55,000, he said desperately. $100,000, I replied, and the room gasped. It was over. Damien lowered his paddle with a look of complete defeat, and the auctioneer's gavel came down with finality. I'd just spent $100,000 on a vacation I didn't need, but the look on Damien's face made it worth every penny. After the auction, as people mingled and congratulated me on my generous bidding, Vanessa approached me alone. Damien was nowhere to be seen, probably in the men's room trying to compose himself. "That was cruel, even for you," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Cruel?" I replied. "I thought it was business. Isn't that what you taught me? That everything comes down to who can afford what. You're destroying him on purpose. This isn't about money, it's about revenge. You're absolutely right, I said, not bothering to deny it. It is about revenge. You spent 15 years making me feel like a failure, like I wasn't good enough to provide for my own family. You took my children and moved them in with another man, telling them their father was a disappointment. So yes, Vanessa, this is revenge, and I'm just getting started. Her composure cracked slightly. What do you want from me? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. I made mistakes, but I was trying to do what was best for the kids. What's best for the kids is living with their father, who can actually afford to take care of them. Which reminds me, the custody hearing is next week. I hope you've hired a good lawyer. You can't take them away from me, she said, but there was desperation in her voice now. I'm not taking them away. They want to live with me. Jake and Emily are old enough to make their own decisions, and they've decided they'd rather live with their real father than their mother's bankrupt husband. Damien isn't bankrupt. He will be by morning, I interrupted. I'm calling in the rest of his debts tonight. By tomorrow, he'll be lucky if he can afford a studio apartment in Queens. Vanessa stared at me with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. You planned all of this, the inheritance, the business success, even buying Damien's debts. This was all orchestrated. The inheritance was always mine, I corrected. Your family just made sure I didn't know about it. But yes, everything else has been carefully planned. You taught me that money is power, Vanessa. I'm just applying the lesson. She looked around the ballroom at all the people who had welcomed her into their circle when she was married to a successful tech entrepreneur. These people will never accept me without Damien's money. You know that. That's not my problem anymore. You made your choice when you decided I wasn't good enough. Now you get to live with the consequences. Damien appeared at her elbow, looking pale and defeated. We should go, he said quietly. Yes, you should, I agreed. And Damien, those other debts I mentioned, my lawyers will be in touch in the morning. I'd suggest you start looking for more affordable accommodations. They left without another word, and I spent the rest of the evening accepting congratulations from people who saw my victory over Damien as a masterful display of social and financial dominance. The custody hearing the following week was a formality. With my unlimited resources and the children's expressed preference to live with me, the judge had little choice but to award me primary custody. Vanessa was granted visitation rights, but Jake and Emily made it clear they had no interest in spending time with her until she was willing to acknowledge what she'd done to our family. Moving them into my penthouse was one of the happiest days of my life. Watching them explore their new rooms, seeing the relief on their faces as they realized their future was secure, made every moment of the past year worthwhile. But there was still one final piece of business to attend to. I found Damien 3 weeks later at a dive bar in Queens, drinking cheap whiskey and staring at his phone like it might magically display a message that would solve all his problems. He'd lost weight and his expensive clothes had been replaced with off-the-rack suits that didn't quite fit properly. Mind if I join you? I asked, sliding into the booth across from him. He looked up with eyes that had lost all their former confidence. Come to gloat? Actually, I came to make you an offer. He laughed bitterly. What could you possibly offer me that I'd want? I pulled out a cashier's check and placed it on the table between us. $2 million, enough to pay off all your remaining debts and start over somewhere else. He stared at the check like it might be a mirage. What's the catch? No catch. But there are conditions. You leave New York tonight and never come back. You never contact Vanessa or my children again. And you disappear so completely that none of us ever have to think about you again. And if I don't take the money, then you continue living like this until your remaining creditors lose patience. I hear some of them are less civilized than I am. He picked up the check with shaking hands. Why? Why would you do this? Because my revenge was never really about you, Damien. You were just a symptom of the disease. The real problem was people thinking they could use my family against me and get away with it. That problem has been solved. He pocketed the check and stood up without another word. I never saw him again. Vanessa tried to reconcile with the children over the following months, but the damage was too deep. They'd lost faith in her judgment and her honesty, and no amount of apologies could rebuild what had been broken. She eventually moved to California, where she got a job at a marketing firm and tried to rebuild her life away from the wreckage of her Manhattan dreams. As for me, I threw myself into running Carlson Industries with the same methodical precision I'd used to destroy my enemies. The company flourished under my leadership. growing from a $250 million enterprise to something much larger and more influential. Jake graduated from an elite prep school and was accepted to Harvard with plans to study business. Emily discovered a talent for art and was already being courted by prestigious galleries for her photography work. They both understood that their father had fought for them when it mattered most, and that understanding became the foundation of a relationship stronger than anything we'd had before. Standing on my penthouse balcony one evening, watching the sun set over Central Park, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been a broken man living above a boxing gym, convinced that I was a failure who'd lost everything that mattered to him. Now I was one of the most powerful men in New York, with resources that could make or break careers, and children who respected and loved me for who I truly was. The best revenge, they say, is living well. But sometimes I've learned the best revenge is making sure the people who wronged you understand exactly what they've lost, and ensuring they never get the chance to take it from you again. My grandfather's letter had been right. Some people only understand consequences when they're delivered with interest. I delivered those consequences in full, with compound interest that would last a lifetime. Justice had finally come calling, and it had brought friends.